Good morning. This is the webinar for what are clinical trials and why I should be involved. Can I do? Okay, thank you. My name is Penny Cowan. I'm one of the founders of the World Patient Alliance and secretary for the last 40 plus years. I was the founder and CEO of the American Chronic Pain Association. And I'm delighted to be here and share this very important topic with all of you. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart for a variety of reasons. Clinical trials is something that we don't talk about often, but I think it's really important to learn as much as we can about it. Can I have the next slide, please? So we have a very full agenda this morning. Okay, but first of all, the World Patient Alliance is an umbrella organization of patient and patient organizations from around the globe. The WPA provides the platform to empower and raise patient voice for the provisions of and access, quality, and affordable healthcare. We represent patients from all world regions across all disease areas. Currently, we have 446 member organizations from over 121 countries. And as you can see, all the green areas on the map is where we actually have members. Next slide, please. So we're going to look at what are clinical trials and a little introduction, what we need to ask. And before I go to clinical trials, we're going to talk to somebody from the World Health Assembly on the 2022 resolution on clinical trials. And then what I really like about this, we're actually going to get some people who have actually experienced clinical trials on both sides, those that are working as part of the research team and those who have actually been involved. So without any further ado, I'd like the next slide, and I will introduce our first speaker. Next slide, please. These are our speakers. And the next slide is Dr. Sean Mackey from the University of Stanford. He is the chief of the Division of Pain Medicine at Stanford University. His bio is on the screen. You will read it. I don't want to waste a lot of time with these long introductions. What I can tell you about every one of our speakers, that they are extremely knowledgeable, and I held each one of them in the highest regard. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Mackey and let him present his presentation. Thank you. Dr. Mackey.
Thank you, Penny, and welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today to get this kicked off after the wonderful introductions by Penny. As was mentioned, I'm Sean Mackey. I'm a professor and chief of the Division of Pain Medicine at Stanford University, where I've been for now well over a couple decades. And my goal in this brief time that we have together is to set a foundation, to lay the brickwork that everybody else will be building upon in this topic of clinical trials. So I'll be talking about some of the basics of what exactly are clinical trials, the different types of clinical trials, perhaps the most important question for you: why should you be involved in clinical trials? What some of the questions you might ask about being in clinical trials, and then we'll pass the baton over, and our colleagues will then build upon those foundations. Why am I qualified to talk about this? Well, I've been running clinical trials for well over 20 years now. I've been NIH funded for 20 plus years, and I've run all types of clinical trials, from observational clinical trials to treatment clinical trials to standard randomized and pragmatic clinical trials. And so why don't we get things kicked off here? And can I have the next slide? And we'll start off with just some language introductions. What are clinical trials? And that'll help lay again the groundwork for the rest of this. So these are research studies that we perform in people that are aimed at evaluating a medical, surgical, mind-body behavioral intervention. They are the primary way that researchers find out if a new treatment, like a drug, a diet, a medical device, is safe and effective for people. They have a specific set of standards and protocols that we use that are applied in various phases, if it is in particular a treatment trial, and each is designed to learn a distinct aspect of that potential new treatment. Now, there's other types of clinical trials other than treatment trials. We'll get to some of that. but that will all fit within this rubric. Next slide. Probably the most important question on my slide deck. Why should I be involved in clinical trials? What's in it for me, in other words? Well, there's a variety of reasons for this, and I've outlined this in kind of helping you to better understand the pros and the cons of this. Perhaps one of the most important is that you get access to new treatments, that you get access to treatments that might not be normally available to the general public. And this can be particularly effective or particularly significant for people who have conditions where there are limited or no effective treatments. You can contribute to medical research by being part of clinical trials. You get to help advance clinical science. Your participation leads to discoveries that benefit future patients and contribute to the understanding of your condition and its treatment. You get access to high quality care. These clinical trials are often providing participants with close and regular medical oversight from a team of specialized clinicians and researchers in that particular space. There are potential personal benefits. While there's no guarantee that you're going to get an active treatment for your condition, there is a good chance that you will and that you're going to get some particular benefit from it. There's cost benefits. In many of these trials, the treatments, the procedures, the medical consultation that are related to the research, these costs are covered by the research, and there also can be cost reimbursements for your travel and your time. There's empowerment aspect. You're taking an active role in your own healthcare, and that can help you to have long-term downstream consequences to improve your particular conditions. You're often engaged with a supportive community where these clinical trials offer groups or counseling. You can connect with others who are going through the same or similar experiences, and there's great learning opportunities. Probably one of the larger benefits also, you're learning more about your own condition while you're going through this journey. But there are also some potential downsides to clinical trials and being a participant. There are potential side effects if it is a treatment trial, and they may be unknown as to whether they range from mild to even severe side effects. And this is a question you'll want to ask. There's time that is involved with this, and they're asking you to show up at regularly scheduled periods of time to have assessments, to fill out surveys for regular medical appointments. There may be costs that you have to bear. Not all the costs in clinical trials may be reimbursed by the research site, and there may be expenses like travel that aren't reimbursed. And then there's the emotional and physical impact. You're facing unknowns with regard to your treatment of your condition. You don't know if you're getting the active or the placebo of it, and that can lead to many emotional ups and downs, and that in itself can be taxing. So the key in all of this is to take all these pros and cons, the benefits and the risks, weigh those for you individually before getting into and making a decision about whether to participate in a clinical trial. Can I have the next slide, please? So what happens in a clinical trial? What are the points along the pathway of a clinical trial? Well, in this, you're going to undergo a number of specific procedures, tests, and treatments as per the study design. And it breaks down into the following sequence. There's typically a screening visit where you'll undergo an eligibility scan. In other words, you may be filling out surveys, there may be a physical examination, there's frequently an interview, and they're going to determine, are you an appropriate candidate for this? And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen in clinical trials is that people often get disappointed when they're found not to be a candidate. And it often has nothing to do with them personally. It has to do with these clinical trials have very rigid eligibility criteria. For instance, many of the patients that I care for and see with chronic pain have multiple chronic pain conditions. And we may be doing a trial that only allows in a person with a single chronic condition and not the whole complexity that they represent. There's informed consent. And this informed consent details the study's purpose, the duration, the required procedures that you have to participate in, the potential risks and the benefits. And you want to read this carefully, ask any questions, and then sign the form. After that, there's typically, if it's a treatment clinical trial, a randomization period in which someone is randomized to either the active treatment or often a placebo control. Sometimes it is another active control treatment in which we're trying to compare one against the other. And then there's the interventions which you're going to receive. These could be either a drug, a medical device, a procedure, behavioral therapy, other type of intervention, and people will be given instructions on how to use and when to use that intervention. There'll be regular checkups. And so the research staff will be checking in on a regular basis to see how people are doing, to make sure that there's no untoward side effects, and if there are, what to do about those side effects. We may ask you to fill out diaries or logs. These are sometimes daily surveys of how you're feeling in the moment, and we will be asking again for any types of side effects. Throughout this, we want to maintain good, active communication between the research staff and the research participant. And so once again, if there's any changes in their health, and we find this frequently, that life moves on. People have surgeries, they go out of state, they have family emergencies that pop up. We want to know about those so that we can help accommodate them and adjust the clinical trial accordingly. Then there's the end of the participation period. When the trial ends, there's a final check-in period. This is to make sure that you've been safe throughout this trial, to monitor for any late developing side effects and gather any final data. There's a post-trial access in which, if you got benefit from that intervention, we can have a discussion about whether there is ongoing access to that treatment for you. And then lastly, the results of the trial. We'll also frequently tell you if you were in a treatment trial, whether you were randomized to the active condition or whether you were randomized to the placebo condition. Sometimes in the randomization to the placebo condition, we'll make available the active treatment as well as a run-in period of time. And also, if possible, we'll tell you the results of the clinical trial. Sometimes people get disappointed, and we let them know up front that the results may not be forthcoming because they're not interpretable at an individual level. We can only interpret the results at a group level. But we'll at least try to give them something that is useful where they can learn from that. Next slide, please. What are the different types of clinical trials? And it turns out there's a cornucopia of clinical trials, and each of these are aimed at getting at different types of questions that we have in clinical research. The most common are treatment trials, which, as alluded, we're testing the benefits of a device, a drug, a behavioral intervention, or something else. And they have multiple phases of these clinical trials, from phase 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. We're not going to dive into all the details of those because of time, but each of those are meant to get at different aspects of safety of the treatment and then also the effectiveness of the treatment. One of the most common types of treatment trials is a randomized controlled trials, in which we take people with a particular condition and we randomize them to either an active treatment or a placebo control or another active treatment. What you're seeing more frequently are these trials called pragmatic trials, and these are gaining significant interest in the research area. And the reason for these trials are that typical randomized control trials will take very homogeneous people, meaning people with a single condition, and they tend to exclude people with any additional conditions. And as such, we end up with people that don't look like the real world. And these have come under some criticism lately. And so we've been evolving into this area of pragmatic trials where, in essence, we take all comers with the condition. The upside of it is that we're studying more real-world patients with a lived condition. The downside is you're introducing in what we refer to as more noise into it, so you have to have larger numbers of people participating. We also have observational trials that may or may not involve a treatment. These may be just tracking you over time to see how your condition evolves to determine if we can learn something about your condition. What are the factors that contribute to maintaining your condition, amplifying your condition, and resolving your condition? There are prevention trials to better find ways to prevent diseases in people who have never had the particular condition. You may be familiar with, for instance, the COVID vaccines or classic prevention trials. Registry trials are not strictly trials, but they're databases of patients with a particular condition who've undergone a particular treatment, and they help in tracking long-term outcomes. There are diagnostic trials which are aimed at better understanding and detecting certain diseases or health conditions. There are genetic trials which are rather self-evident here to understand whether certain genes are contributing to a particular condition, and also to help us to target specific treatments for people with a genetic profile. And then finally, there's pilot or feasibility trials, which tend to be very small scale in numbers, and they're to determine whether there's value in going forward with the treatment. May I have the last slide, please? So what should you think about before joining a clinical trial? Well, first of all, this gets back to the what's in it for me. You want to know what the purpose of the study is and understand all the details that I presented in that prior slide. You want to understand the risks and the benefits, what the eligibility criteria as to whether you're an appropriate candidate for this. How long is this study going to be ongoing? What is the duration of it, and whether you're willing and able to commit to the duration of that study? Are you able to meet the geographic requirements for location and travel? And then what's going to be expected of you from the procedures and the interventions, which might include medical tests, the therapy itself, may involve hospital stays or other interventions. You want to know whether this is a standard treatment or a new approach. We're frequently these days testing standard therapies to determine if they work against another standard therapy versus a new procedure or new approach that may never have been tested before. You want to understand the nature of the blinding and the placebo, whether you're going to get exposed potentially to a placebo. You want to understand the informed consent process, the costs and the compensation to you. How much is this going to cost you? How much are they going to pay me? And then whether they're going to give you access to the treatment after the trial. Know your rights with regard to withdrawing. You're always empowered to withdraw from a trial at any point in time. Before doing so, please do communicate with the the research team, so that you can talk through any particular issues. Privacy is paramount. You want to know how your data is being protected. You want to be also able to provide adequate feedback to the research group. And then last, there has to be trust. There has to be trust and comfort and confidence in your research team. Much of this is a relationship that you are building. So with that, we're right at 15 minutes, and I appreciate your taking this journey with me as we discuss some of the foundations of clinical trials. What are clinical trials? Why should you consider being in a clinical trial? What happens during a clinical trial, the different types of clinical trials, and then what you should think about before joining a clinical trial. And with that, I'm going to pass the baton back to Penny, who will hand it off to Dr. Raghu, and we'll continue on this journey. Thank you.
I was on mute. Thank you very much. That was very informative. And what I saw from the chat is that people were really enjoying your presentation and talking about how important it is. And I think one of the things that, you're welcome. And one of the things that I wanted to say for me, why this is so important, is really clinical trials are really set the future for medicine as a whole. You know, without those, things just don't move forward. So with that, is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lambert Rago, and he is a clinical professor of pharmacology and the founder and first director general of the Estonia Drug Regulatory Authority, State Assembly of Medicine. He is also currently, let's see, and sorry about that, guys. He is currently the part of the Council for International Organizations of Medicine and Science, CIOMS, and with without further ado, I will go ahead and introduce him. He's going to talk about what do I ask before I go to clinical trials, which is also very important to gain that better understanding of being as informed as possible into these trials. So without any further ado, Dr. Rego, I'd like to turn that over to you.
Thank you, Penny. It's a great pleasure and honor to be with you today. And let's go to my first slide. So what do I ask before I go for a clinical trial? And I'm Dr. Glenn Bichago. At present, I'm the Secretary General for the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences. And of course, we have been involved in the topic quite a lot. And recently we issued a booklet, which was 2021, which I was part of it, Clinical Research in Resource Limited Settings. And we had 2022 also patient involvement in the development, regulation, and safe use of medicines. But let's continue. And the content, I would give some couple of words about the CIMS, and then go to the bit background of clinical trials, some essential questions, additional potential questions, and conclusions. Next slide, please. So Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences was founded in 1949 by WHO and UNESCO. It is in official relations with WHO. It's UNESCO associated partner. And since 2016, it's also observer in ICH. And the mission of SciAMS is to advance public health through guidance on health research, including ethics, medical product development, and safety pharmacovigilance. And below are some of the recent publications we have. Next slide, please. Well, first of all, before we go to the clinical trial, I think it's also important aspect is really the ethical background of clinical trials. The ethical justification for undertaking health-related research involving humans is its scientific and social value. The prospect of generating the knowledge and the means necessary to protect and promote people's health. Patients, health professionals, researchers, policymakers, public health officials, pharmaceutical companies, and others rely on the results of research for activities and decisions that impact individuals and public health, welfare, and the use of limited resources. And also we have to note that scientific and social value cannot legitimize subjecting study participants or host communities to mistreatment or injustice. So this is more background into this topic is in the International Ethical Guidelines for Health-Related Research Involving Humans, CIOMS 2016, guideline first scientific and social value and respect for rights. So next one, please. Then going a bit to the more, giving some insights, very scratching the surface, scientific and motivation background. The goal of clinical trials is to determine with scientific methods if the proposed treatment, prevention, and behavior approaches are safe and effective. And of course, people take part in clinical trials for many reasons. Below, some are listed, like for healthy volunteers. They can take part to help others and to contribute to moving science forward, to foster innovation. That may be in first-in-man studies, but also healthy people may sometimes benefit themselves, and this is in case of vaccines. And of course, if you take the majority of clinical research, clinical trials, then this is people who have certain illnesses, diseases. They may take part to help others, but also to possibly receive the newest treatment and to have added or extra care and attention from the clinical trial staff. That can be also an additional motivation. And of course, clinical trials offer hope for many people and a chance to help researchers find better treatments for others in the future. Now, there is, of course, a lot of all type of information sources, I have listed only one, which is from the European context, from European Patients Initiative. What is a clinical research? Next slide, please. Then, before entering the clinical trial, I think it's good if potential trial participants ask certain set of questions to try to get more confidence in before they join. And perhaps the good to start is the trial approved by an ethics committee or review board? To ensure that the study has been reviewed and approved by an independent research ethics committee or institutional review board to protect participants' rights and welfare. Second could be about the informed consent. What is the informed consent process? To understand the process of providing informed consent, including what information you receive and your right to ask questions before agreeing to participate. And that's in the SIOM's guideline, Appendix 2, obtaining informed consent, essential information for prospective research participants. And also, of course, very important question is who is conducting the trial? To learn about the researchers and the institution overseeing the study, including their qualifications and experience. Also important is to ask possibility to continue with my current treatments. There is a lot of patients who have already on certain treatments, and of course it's a natural interest to understand what really happens to these treatments. Do you have to stop them, adjust them, how they influence the participation? Next one. It's also important to understand better what is the purpose of the study, understand the overall goal of the clinical trial and what researchers aim to learn or achieve. It's also important to know what is the treatment being tested, to get more explanation of the treatment, including experimental or intervention, how it works, what is it expected to happen to you, is there any chance that I get placebo? That's also very important to understand, that is the likeliness that you are assigned to a placebo, and to understand the consequences of that. Then it's also important to ask a question, what are the potential benefits for me or for others also, because sometimes it's also that you want to produce more good for the others and you participate in anticipation that you help the others. You maybe not really help yourself, but you may help the others still. Ask about the potential positive outcomes or improvements in your condition that the treatment might offer. And if you cannot benefit, can others benefit? How likely are these benefits happening to? And then, of course, what are the potential risks and side effects, the other side of the coin, and learn about any known or potential risks, side effects, and complications associated with the treatment. This includes short-term and long-term effects. How likely are the major risk side effects affecting me? Important to consider. And in SIOM's guideline, it's guideline 4, potential individual benefits and risks of research. Next one, please. It's also good to know how long will the trial last, get an estimate of the duration of the study and the time commitment involved, including the number of visits, tests, and treatments. It's also important to have a question, can I leave the trial at any time? To understand your rights to withdraw from the trial at any point, and the implications of doing that. And it's also important to ask, perhaps, what are the costs and compensation? Inquire about any costs associated in participation, such as medical tests and treatments, and whether there is compensation for your time and expenses. And again, it's covered by some of the guidelines as well. And also, it is important to have some ideas what's happening after the trial, when the trial is over. Will I receive follow-up care after the trial? Ask about any plans for continued monitoring or care after the trial ends. There are, of course, many other questions to ask, and some of them could be additional or in the basic package of questions to be asked. Next slide. It all depends on the concrete situation. Now, some additional question. Who is eligible for the trial? To understand the inclusion-exclusion criteria to determine if you meet the requirements. To understand a bit about the study design. What is the study design? Learn about the study structure, randomized controlled trial, observation, any other type of the design. And then, of course, are there other treatment options available? Discuss alternative treatments or options for your condition outside the trial. And also, possibly, where can I find more information? There is always more information, and you should try to ask what are the sources that you could read more and get more information available. And also, sometimes it would be perhaps useful to talk to other participants. So you can also ask, can I talk to other participants? If possible, inquire whether you can connect with other participants to learn about the experiences. Next one, please. So this was just a very quick going through of some of the issues of background. Like very important point is ethics of the clinical research, the ethical background. And of course, trying to give some examples of some of the potential questions that could be asked by potential trial participants. And in conclusion, I would say that the more mature are the questions asked by trial participants, and the more mature are the answers, the better is to all of the stakeholders of the clinical trial enterprise. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you, Dr. Rego. That was really interesting, and you brought up some really important questions that people need to ask. One of the things I'll tell all of our listeners is that we're going to hold those questions till the end. I've been keeping track of the questions in the chat, so once we get to discussion, we'll go back and ask those questions. So again, thank you so much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Morthley, who is the Senior Advisor of the WHO Research for Health Department at the Scientific Division of the World Health Organization in Geneva. And he is going to look at what is the WHO doing to enable quality evidence generation from the clinical trials ecosystem. So without any further ado, Dr. Morthley, you can take it away. Hello?
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Just to clarify that I'm not with the University of Oxford, despite what you can see behind me. I just happen to be visiting, and I'm using one of their terminals. Thank you to the World Patients Alliance for giving the World Health Organization some time to really just update you on some developments from the World Health Organization's perspective. The key background that I would like to give you is in the next couple of slides as to why we have a resolution from the World Health Assembly last year on clinical trials, on improving clinical trials. The next slide, please. So this is one of the rooms in the World Health Assembly. This is where delegates from every Ministry of Health of our 195 member states come and really set the agenda for the next year of our work at WHO. And for the first time since 2005, last year, they agreed a resolution on clinical trials. In 2005, it was agreed that no clinical trial should occur unless it is publicly registered in a registry that anybody can find, including patients. And actually, the need for patients to have awareness of what clinical trials are underway was a major reason why in 2005 we had that resolution. Now, this is by what happened in the COVID-19 pandemic. So the next slide. This is a graphic from our guidelines for COVID-19 therapeutics, which shows where we have strong recommendations either to use a medicine or not to use a medicine. I think maybe somebody needs to go on mute. I can hear some coughing in the background. So where we have strong recommendations, it means that there is good quality evidence, and that means from clinical trials. So clinical trial evidence underpins almost everything that we have in health in terms of what medicines are available in the pharmacy, what vaccines our children have received. This is all based on good clinical trials. And what we saw is that from the over 20,000 COVID-19 clinical trials that happened to try and identify how to save lives or prevent COVID-19, just a very few of the trials provided most of the useful evidence. And here, wherever we have strong recommendations to use something, it was based on a series of very good trials. And some of those very good trials were done by the public sector, and some were done by the private sector. So that is great news, because we have a lot of positive examples that we can build on. And I think much of the resolution is asking us to amplify the successful stories that came out of the pandemic. But I'm afraid it's not all good news. The next slide shows that according to one analysis, over 90%, here it says 95% of the trial arms. So that means if you have a clinical trial, it might be that half of the patients are randomized to the new drug and half are randomized to an old drug. So there would be two arms. It's saying here that the overwhelming majority of the trial arms, and that means the overwhelming majority of the trials, were not going to provide useful information, which is clearly a big problem. And it highlights some problems that we have broadly described as research waste. And this has, and I'd be happy to take more questions about, really what is underlying this. But this is really what led to the resolution, so that we can develop some guidance to amplify the good trials and see what can be done to incentivize more the good trials and less the bad trials. Next slide. So the key features of this resolution, which has already been agreed by essentially all of the governments of the world, are to let's put clinical trials very centrally in the health sector and understand their importance in generating the knowledge that we all use in what medicines or vaccines or other interventions are used. And it calls for all of the relevant national authorities and other actors, and this would include, for example, patient representatives, community representatives, but also private sector, public sector actors, to really look at how we can focus these trials on what is going to lead to the most useful outcomes and then drive decision-making. And it's asked us to develop some guidance for anyone interested in trials. And if I have one message from this talk, is that we have a guidance document which is already based on the best existing guidance we could find, that is now out for public consultation. And there are definitely some aspects of that where we would like input from patients and patient organizations about how we describe patient engagement in clinical trials. Next slide. So that is the key message. This guidance is out. It's called WHO Best Practices for Clinical Trials, Guidance on, and that is out for public consultation, but perhaps the World Patients Alliance could help by disseminating the link for the requesting input. Once we have finalized this document, and there are two existing guidances that are already essentially incorporated into this. Dr. Rego is on the line, and one of those existing documents is a CIOMS document called Clinical Research in Resource Limited Settings, which is directly aligned with the scope here. And we have directly taken, with CIOMS permission, input and adoption into this draft guidance. There's another document called the Good Clinical Trials Collaborative, goodtrials.org, which is more about design. That is also included. So we are not repeating what others have done, but we are really complementing the landscape to try and focus on some key reforms that are needed in clinical trials. We then plan to develop training materials that can be used by anybody involved. And one of the things that we'd be very happy to work with partners on are specific materials that are really aimed at educating patients about engagement in clinical trials. That could come later. We're engaged in various mappings, and there are also a number of consultations that we're planning, virtual ones such as this, but there are also 5 in-person ones. 4 of them are in these 4 WHO regions that are in the third column. The Pan-American region, that's going to be in Brasilia, in Brazil, co-hosted by the Ministry of Health of Brazil in October. The Southeast Asian region in Delhi in India, the African region in Lusaka in Zambia, and the EMRA region in Cairo in Egypt. And these are all led by the WHO regional offices. And the whole purpose of those is to ensure that we really receive input from stakeholders in the global south. We also, of course, have a lot of input from stakeholders in high-income countries, for example, the European Medicines Agency, the US FDA, many other groups, the US NIH, are very important stakeholders that we're also liaising with. So we have a huge outreach at the moment to try to get input to the draft guidance and later on coordinate implementation with all of these stakeholders. Next slide. So these are the basic elements that are in this WHO guidance. I'm not going to read all of these out. And this is what we aim to add. Again, I'm not going to read all of this out. The slides can be shared with all of you. Next slide. And these are the audiences. Again, I think I've touched on this. Next slide. One of the things that has come out of the consultations already are, I think there's emerging agreement on what are some of the key barriers. And I've highlighted some of the ones in bold here that are perhaps particularly important for this audience. We don't really have necessarily generally agreed best practices for how patients should engage with clinical trials. And this could be on the choice of priorities for trials, how they're designed so that the outcomes they look at are really relevant and meaningful to patients, how we can make sure that the results are provided back to participants in trials. Related would be what are the best practices for community engagement, and also how can patients be involved in design. And like I said, the outcomes. So if we're looking at what a clinical trial, does a medicine reduce or prevent something, it needs to be meaningful what it is preventing from the patient perspective. So we need to make sure we have the right patient involvement in the way these trials are set up. Next slide. These are some of the other barriers that or areas for further work. So I won't go through all of these. Just one would be underserved or underrepresented populations. I mean, there are a number of these. There isn't enough information in children. Obviously, we have to have the right ethical safeguards when we are conducting trials in children. But really, we need more information in pediatric populations so that we can make sure that we can provide medicines and vaccines for these populations. The same goes for pregnant and breastfeeding women, but also, for example, rare diseases, neglected tropical diseases. There are a number of areas where we just aren't doing enough to generate evidence in this area. And then in the area of transparency, I've just highlighted, we have already clarity that all trials must be registered so everybody knows what is happening while they're underway. I think an area where we could do more is just really ensure that we're providing the results back to the participants. This should happen, and it's already happening, but we can maybe do more to just really make this very systematic and ensure that it happens in all trials. Next slide. And just wrapping up, there are a number of these sort of mapping activities, what trials are underway, what initiatives, and what sort of capabilities there are in countries. We're going to be providing these publicly on our website. So some of that might be interesting for patients to have a bit more visibility on what is really happening in their country or for their disease. And it might even help them line up access to certain clinical trials in areas that they're interested in. And I think I'm going to finish there. Next slide, which I think is just to acknowledge that we have funding from an entity called the European and Developing Countries Clinical Trials Partnership, which works between Europe and Africa, as well as from the UK government through NIHR to do this work. And thank you again for the invitation to talk to you. I'll hand back to the moderator.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. And a lot of the questions, again, we're going to hold those till the end, but a lot of them were about how they can find the the guidance document, and I don't know whether or not we can put that down in the chat, the link to that, so that people can see that, just in case.
I will
you know,
I will put that in the chat myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Okay, moving on. Our next speaker is Christine Beasley. She is the co-founder and director of the Chronic Pain Research Alliance and director of patient engagement at Action, the initiative, which is a public-private partnership with the FDA and the University of Rochester. She's been really involved in clinical trials from the perspective of being part of a research team, and she is extremely knowledgeable. I have nothing but the highest respect for Chris, so I'm going to let her go ahead and take it away. So thank you, Chris, for joining us.
Thanks, Penny, and thanks to the other organizers for inviting me to talk today. So as Penny mentioned, I'm going to share my expertise and experience with clinical trials. So far, we've really been talking about the perspective of actually participant, or to be a participant in a clinical trial, but I'm going to touch a little bit on a different activity, which would be actually as a patient or an advocacy organization leader or community member actually partnering with the research team to help develop the clinical trial and then conduct the clinical trial and disseminate findings of the trial. Next slide. So typically, when an investigator puts together a clinical research trial, such as Dr. Mackey, he or she will surround themselves with a team of people that are usually within a medical system or a university system. So that team typically would involve a clinical researcher, like I said, like Dr. Mackey. You may have a data manager or statistician, a research assistant, a pharmacist, or a project manager. There can be other members of the team, but this is the basic core of most teams for clinical trials. Next slide. But in the last few years, there's actually been, not few, I'd say over the decade or more, there has been a push to challenge this traditional research model because it doesn't include people that actually suffer from the conditions which the trials are studying, or other people that use the data that come out of these trials. And you may have heard this quote, "Nothing about us without us." And you can advance, please. This has just been a, you advance the slide, please. This quote and this movement has really been used to give a voice to the idea that those who are affected by research really have a right to influence what's researched and how it's done. So participating in actually developing the questions that are going to be researched in a study, and how you actually do that with the patient participation. Next slide, please. So that's led to this kind of traditional research team to grow and expand to including other end users of the data or the findings that come out of clinical trials. And those are actually listed here in the red. So that could include patients, people that suffer from the conditions that the trials are researching. It could include other types of doctors, not just the clinical researcher that's running the trial, but other types of doctors that or clinicians that may be using the data that comes out of the trial. Includes medical insurance companies and health systems and other important stakeholder groups. So the way that clinical research has really changed over the last decade is that these research teams are now including this broader perspective in various ways to actually plan the trial, conduct the trial, and then disseminate the important findings of the trial. Next slide. So we may ask, well, why do this, right? And one of the big pushes from the patient and patient advocacy organizations is that a lot of the findings that come out of certain studies or trials don't necessarily make their way into the clinic or the hands of patients or others who can use them, right? So why is engagement important? Why do we need to include the perspectives of patients and other community members in the actual research team? And studies have actually shown that it leads to more meaningful outcomes for the studies. So for example, patients can tell research teams what actual outcomes are important to them. So in my expertise is in pain, one of the biggest shifts in our area has been not just measuring how much pain a person has, but how much that pain actually limits their quality of life and their ability to function. And so those measures are now typically included in all trials on pain. It actually helps to make sure that findings of the studies are actually disseminated widely, and that people who need to know about these findings are actually learning about the trial, learning about what the trial found and how they can incorporate it into their clinical practice, or as a patient, how they can use that information to make informed healthcare decisions about themselves. And it also advances health equity. And these are just a couple examples of how engagement has really changed clinical research. Next slide. So you may wonder, like, what ways specifically a person like me who has 30 years of lived experience with chronic pain or some other health condition can actually be a partner and contribute to the research team. And these are just a few examples. But the first is that patients and other community members really help scientists identify what are the really major questions that patients have. You know, what do they struggle with when they're trying to live day to day? Do they not have enough information on certain drugs that may be available for their condition, or non-pharmacologic options? What's important to patients, and how can we work together to develop research questions that would be then answered by the clinical trials that are planned and designed and conducted? You can actually, as a patient, help to design the research study plan. So, for example, patients, really have a lot of in-depth knowledge about what's doable or not doable for patients, and what may impact their decision to actually enroll in a treatment study. So let's say an investigator has a protocol that's going to last an 8-hour day. A patient can say, okay, well, if a patient needs to come to do this study for 8 hours in one day, here's what we need to do throughout the day to make sure that person is comfortable. Do they need to take breaks? Do they need a lunch break? What do we need to do to actually make sure that we can optimize the research plan and the study so that participants are actually able to take part in it, and don't say no to the trial because they look at it and say, well, I just can't do that. It's too much for me. And that's just, one example. We also help to improve ways to recruit people to participate in clinical research, and how to keep them engaged throughout the study so that they actually complete it. We help to develop and write study advertisement materials. And this is extremely important because the way that you even just the title of your study, or it makes a huge difference in terms of whether patients will actually be interested in learning more about it. And then how you write up what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what's involved in the study in your ad materials are extremely important. If people can't understand what your research is about, and why you're doing it and what might be required out of you to participate, they're much less likely to inquire about participating in a study. So these are small but simple things, but extremely important in terms of planning and designing clinical trials that actually come to completion. We as patient partners may help to review the data that comes out of a study and help interpret the results of it. And then, very importantly, as the prior speaker mentioned, we work with you to help disseminate the study findings to diverse communities. So in addition to writing the findings of the studies up and publishing them in a medical journal, we really think through, okay, what are the groups of people or stakeholders who really need to know about the findings of these studies? And how do we reach these people and get this information to them? Next slide. So that's just a really quick snapshot of how patients can actually partner with clinical research teams to improve the clinical research that's conducted and how it gets disseminated and taken up by the clinical community. And I love this quote that says, research is better when we do it together. And if you want to learn more about these types of opportunities, I invite you to click on the link here for CORI, which is a US-based organization that does a lot of work around patient engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was really important. And I think one of the important things that you brought up and has been emphasized before is the fact that not only are the clinical trials done and results, but actually the follow through, putting them in the clinic. And, so it's all about the patient. You said nothing about us without us. And, from beginning to end, but actually getting that information into real practice, which is really the whole point of doing these trials and improving the care of the patient. So my next speaker is Ruth, and excuse me if I don't pronounce your last name, Makubi, and she's the Executive Director of Sickle Cell Association of Uganda. She also comes with real life experience as a person who has taken part in clinical trials and been involved in them. So without any further ado, Ruth, you want to go ahead and do your presentation?
Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this. My name is Ruth Nankanja Muchibi, the Executive Director, Sickle Cell Association of Uganda. I have sickle cell disease myself. And so my presentation is about the importance of a strong regulation system in the healthcare. Next slide, please. Yes, according to WHO, the global benchmarking tool, regulatory system play a key role in assuring the quality, safety, and efficacy of medical products. Effective regulatory systems are an essential component of health systems and contribute to desired public health outcomes and innovations. Next slide, please. Yes, and then if we want to look at the importance of regulatory systems, what do they do? A strong regulatory system helps patients keep track of the health systems right from planning, budgeting, implementation, and evaluation. I think sometimes as patients, sometimes we ask too much or we don't know what is provided for at which level, but if we know that the system is strong, this can help us to keep track on what is available at what point of care. Then it reduces the expectation from patients because they are able to know which services are given in particular station. Then with strong systems in place, it reduces on the problem of corruption, especially for us in Africa. And then the biggest problem of counterfeits and self-medication, which improves on the quality of life for patients. Because if we get to know and we really know that these are the things that we are supposed to do, we do them well. So it helps us to make sure that we take quality medicine and then we do not also self-medicate. May I have the next slide, please? Yes, so how are African patients engaging in regulatory activities? As African patients, we are doing this through advocacy and dialoguing with line ministries. For example, in Uganda, we've been dialoguing with Ministry of Health. And as Sickle Cell Association, we have made strides over this because initially this was a problem that was very big, but was unknown. We didn't even have figures. We didn't know how big the problem was. But through this, the Ministry of Health conducted the research, and now we know the burden of the disease. And so they have started changing many things, right from policy, strategies, and clinical guidelines and training manuals. So as African patients, we also need to seek for appointments to sit on the core committees of Ministry of Health. And sometimes this can be done through media engagements or through research. When we do research and get the right facts, we are able to push for that engagement. And if you have the facts with you, then Ministry of Health will listen to you. And then cultural institutions as well are very key in Africa in trying to help and influence the regulatory systems, because many people believe in this and they have the numbers of people. So then as patient groups, we also need to use joint advocacy. So when we have many patient groups coming together and talking about the same thing, I think government there listens, and then you're able to influence on the regulatory system so that you have positive impacts. For us in Uganda here, we have the Uganda Alliance of Patient Organizations, and it has many patient groups, both communicable and non-communicable diseases, and we have media on board as well. Next slide, please. Yes, so personally, my experience in the patient's regulatory processes. On behalf of Sickle Cell Association, I have been sitting on the Technical Working Committee for Non-Communicable Diseases in Ministry of Health Uganda to represent the interests of sickle cell patients, and National Anemia Working Group, still at Ministry of Health. This has helped to pull sickle cell disease from the closet where it was put 20 years back in the limelight where it is today. The biggest achievement and outcome of our involvement, the government of Uganda conducted a baseline survey for the prevalence of sickle cell disease in 2016. And from that experience, we have changed most of the major documents that Uganda is using. For example, the clinical guidelines, the training manual, the health policy, the essential drug list. And we have also included the hydroxyurea, which is just a new drug according to Uganda, and it was just being sold to patients. But right now, starting from this year, government has started providing for this medicine in the public facilities. So this has helped. Next slide, please. Yes, so what are the barriers for patient involvement in the regulatory processes? Sometimes governments do not allow civil society organizations and individual patients to engage them because they claim that patients have very little knowledge concerning the health systems. And then sometimes governments also claim that patients do not have capacity to engage them. So those are some of the barriers. Next slide, please.
I think you're going in and out a little bit. You might be losing some power.
Sorry. Yeah, we don't have power. That's why I'm not running my video. Can I have next slide? Okay. Tips of creating awareness among East African patient communities. We need to create joint patient groups for research systems strengthening and advocacy. We need to do joint research for us to have actual facts. We also need to be part of the health systems planning, implementation, and evaluation processes and programs right from the word go. Thank you. Next slide. Thank you very much for listening.
All right, thank you all to all our speakers. See, a lot of people are dropping off right now. We did go over a little bit. We do not have time for questions. All of our presenters, thank you so much for giving all of us this rich information. Hopefully this has generated more information, more knowledge, and more questions about clinical trials. I know there were a few questions that were asked on the chat. I will try to get those to the office so that we can get those and address them maybe on a blog or something in our webinar, or get them, on the website, and perhaps even address those to the individuals who requested them. But again, thanks to everyone for taking part in this. Sorry it ran a little bit over, but it was such a rich, informative presentation by all of our presenters. So again, thank you so much. And hopefully each of you go away with a little more understanding about clinical trials, how important they are, and how important it is to have the voice of the patient involved in every step of the way. So thank you all very much for taking part in this.